The production of this DVD is part of the Deafblind Orientation and Mobility Project. This project was funded by Able Australia through the Fundable Future program and is a collaboration between Able Australia and Independent Options for Mobility. On the project team, Meredith Prain, Project Manager, Able Australia; Bronwyn Scott, Orientation and Mobility Specialist, Independent Options for Mobility; Heather Lawson, Expert Advisor and Deafblind Advocate; Dennis Whitcomb, Interpreter, Able Australia; and Jason Stacey, Photographer and Filmmaker. Best practice principles for teaching orientation and mobility skills to a person who is deafblind in Australia. People with deafblindness or dual sensory loss all experience some degree of difficulty in orienting themselves to their environment and moving about safely, particularly in unfamiliar environments. Their communication needs differ from those of people with a single sensory disability, and these communication needs must be addressed when teaching orientation and mobility skills to ensure the best outcome. This DVD will outline some key principles to consider when teaching orientation and mobility skills to a person who is deafblind, and will show some specific signs to use for Auslan users. The information presented is relevant to orientation and mobility specialists, interpreters, deafblind communication guides, people with deafblindness, and their families and support staff. Key principles in teaching a person who has deafblindness. Allow more time. Communication breakdowns occur more frequently for people with deafblindness due to issues hearing in noisy environments, use of interpreters, and missing key visual information such as facial expressions. Also, it is extremely difficult for deafblind people who sign to communicate more than basic information while moving, so conversations can only occur when stationary. For people with a hearing impairment, you should allow 1.5 hours for every hour you would normally plan to spend training. For people who use an interpreter, allow twice as long for each session. Work with the person who is deafblind to decide whether you want longer sessions or more short sessions. For anyone whose first language is Auslan, book an Auslan interpreter through the National Auslan Booking Service or NABS. This service is funded to provide interpreters for medical and allied health appointments, including training with an orientation and mobility specialist. Check with the person if they have a preferred interpreter and if they have special requirements, for example, visual frame or tactile signing. For planning meetings where discussions may last more than 1 hour, book 2 interpreters. If it is a practical training session with more walking and moving around, book 1 interpreter. After the initial planning meeting, book in as many future sessions as necessary with the same interpreter, so concepts can be built upon using the same signs and haptics determined in previous sessions. When booking the interpreter, let them know it is for an orientation and mobility session, so they should wear flat shoes and appropriate clothing for outdoor work and different weather conditions. Let them know they may be travelling on public transport during the session and may end up in a different place to where they started the job. Bookings can be made by calling 1800 24 6945 or by visiting the NABS website at nabs.org.au. Set very clear goals for each lesson. At the start of the lesson, be clear on the concepts and strategies which will be taught and practiced. A lesson may focus only on a technique with little information about landmarks or orientation points. Once the technique is learnt and understood, and there is clear and consistent use of the appropriate signs, then a lesson could focus purely on landmarks. Don't introduce too many new concepts at once, and allow for a longer training program than for someone with a single sensory disability. Explain new terms as you go. There are a number of signs required for teaching orientation and mobility concepts to a person who is deaf. These signs will most likely be new to the person who is deaf, and so will require some explanation and demonstration for them to learn the meaning. Discuss the concepts and relevant signs to be used at the start of the lesson. Use more practice and less talking. The more physical and tactile examples that can be provided, the better the person who is deafblind will understand. Do not spend a lot of time explaining concepts. It's best to demonstrate these concepts using your own body or the body of the person who is deafblind. If you are talking about landmarks and they are within reach, explore these with hands if appropriate, or feet, or a long cane. Don't assume everything you've said has been understood. As mentioned earlier, people with deafblindness experience communication breakdowns more frequently, so it is important to double-check that new concepts and ideas have been understood. Ask the person to recap what has been taught so you can be sure they have understood correctly and can demonstrate the use of new techniques and concepts. Orientation and mobility-related signs. Guiding. First, we're going to look at some signs for guiding. This is the sign for guiding. Sometimes when we guide, we need to talk about narrow spaces. In a conversation about narrow space, this is the sign we would use. But when we're guiding someone through a narrow space, we use the same technique as we would for anyone. There are times when we need to ask the person we're guiding to change sides. We modify the narrow space technique by the guide reaching their free arm behind and guiding the person across. Now we're going to look at some signs related to doorways. The first is a doorway opening towards you. Next, a door opening away from you. A sign for sliding doors, which can be two doors opening at once or only one door sliding in a particular direction. And finally, a sign for lift or elevator. We have three final signs related to guiding. First, we have a sign for stepping up. There is a sign for step up that is used in conversation, and a separate technique we use when guiding someone by raising your guiding arm at the shoulder. There is a conversational sign for step down, and we also have a guiding sign. Finally, we will look at the sign for seat. This is the sign for taking a seat. And guiding someone taking a seat from the front. And approaching from the back of the chair. Alternatively, you could use hand under hand guiding technique. So, approaching from the front. And approaching the chair from the back. For language around orientation, we have one sign that is different. That is for the word landmark. The sign represents permanent there, and that is because a landmark must be something that is permanently in the person's travel environment. These are the signs for long cane mobility. First, the sign for cane and the haptic symbol for cane. Next, the sign for tapping the cane or two-point touch and the haptic symbol for tapping the cane. The sign for constant contact or rolling the cane and the haptic symbol. The sign for tap and slide and the haptic symbol. The sign for shortened cane for use in very busy areas and the haptic symbol. And finally, the sign for shoreline and the haptic symbol, indicating which side the shoreline is on, the left or the right. For independent travel skills, there are haptic symbols we can use. The first is for upper body protection. This is the sign for trailing. When using the haptic sign for trailing, use the side you would like the person to trail on. This is the sign for squaring off. And this is squaring off, aligning your body to cross open space. This is the haptic symbol for search patterns. Firstly, using the grid method of searching. And secondly, a circular method. These are some haptic symbols for giving feedback as you are mobile on the street. Firstly, for yes or good. Secondly, for no. And finally, for stop. Every person with deafblindness will have their own preferences with communication. Don't assume once you've worked with one person who is deafblind that their needs and preferences will be the same for the next person. Take time to get to know the person's communication and learning preferences. If you would like more information about anything discussed in this DVD or about deafblindness or orientation and mobility, please contact Able Australia Deafblind Services.